While many Pontiac fans are familiar with nameplates like the Grand Prix, Bonneville, Catalina, Ventura, Executive, and GTO, quite a few individuals have never heard of a particular Pontiac that was very popular not in the U.S., but in Canada as well as overseas, and that is the Grande Parisienne. And for 1967, the Grande Parisienne offered something that was very special in what was indeed a particular high point for Pontiac in its history. In the U.S., the 1967 model saw a styling refresh that gave the front ends a new look to them, very different from the 1965 and 66 front ends that preceded them, and also different from the 1968 front ends. This was in part due to the fact that the 1967 Pontiacs were designed in the advanced studios as opposed to the Pontiac production studios, and they consequently had this different and more aggressive front end associated with them. 1967 would also see a number of new products and features on Pontiacs for that particular model year, aside from the styling. The first was the new Grand Prix for 1967, which did debut new styling with a new front end panel and particularly attractive turn signals that were visible on the top of a header panel and kind of looked like shark gills or something different from the normal turn signal at least. 67 was also the only year in Pontiac history for the Grand Prix convertible. It was around for only one model year before it would again fade off into history, and another Grand Prix convertible would never be produced by Pontiac. 1967 also saw the introduction of the Pontiac 400 cubic inch V8 and the 428 cubic inch V8, replacing Pontiac's venerable 389 and 421 cubic inch V8s. 67 was also the first year in some time that Pontiac did not offer multiple carburetors on any of their engines, with the top performing engines getting GM's relatively new Quadrajet carburetor. However, there was a very special Pontiac that was available for sale only in Canada and overseas for 1967, and that is the Pontiac Grande Parisienne. Take a look at this brochure from Canada for the 1967 Pontiac lineup, and you see that there's the Grande Parisienne, the Parisien 2+2, the Parisien, the Laurentian, and the Strato Chief in terms of the model lineup. The Strato Chief was the entry-level full-size Pontiac. The Laurentian one up from that. The Parisien one up from that. The Parisien 2+2 being a bit of a sporty vehicle and higher-end vehicle. And the Grande Parisienne was the ultimate Pontiac that you could get for 1967. You can see it pictured here on the front page of this 1967 brochure. Now, I'm sure at this point you're thinking, well, what's so special about this? It looks like a regular old 1967 Grand Prix, and sure, it's got a different name for Canadian buyers, but really, what else is different? Well, quite a bit. Let's examine a bit more. And here you have another page from the 1967 Canadian Pontiac brochure, and you can see what was particularly unique about the Grande Parisienne, and that is that it had a four-door model. So notice the front end of this vehicle is not like a Catalina or an Executive or a Bonneville front end from the U.S. that had the stacked headlights, but you got the Grand Prix's hidden headlight with the super cool turn signals front end grafted onto a four-door vehicle, here a hardtop. Well, that was something that you just couldn't get in the U.S. This particular vehicle was not available. If you wanted a four-door, you had to get the stacked headlight front end. You could not get the Grand Prix hidden headlight front end. And it gives this four-door vehicle, I think, just an awesome look overall. Kind of similar, obviously, to the two-door Grand Prix, but here in a more practical, family-oriented form. I must say that I do love the ad copy. If you look off to the left there and how it reads, it's talking about how the Grande Parisienne was introduced for the 1966 model year. But let's take a look at how the ad copy describes the front end of the vehicle, because I think it's pretty humorous. If you note there, about halfway down the page, it says, for styling, we took our cue from the muscular, masculine look introduced last year. A new massive front end was designed with headlights and parking lights completely hidden, creating a virile, almost arrogant look that promises great power and purpose. Never quite heard a car described as having a virile look, But I suppose it made sense. Clearly, Pontiac was catering to males with this particular ad copy, although I'm sure there were some female buyers of these vehicles as well. And as cool as the brochures look, take a look here at a car in the flesh, a 1967 Grande Parisienne four-door hardtop. Unfortunately, it has these awful aftermarket wheels, but you can still tell that the car has just a great, sleek proportion. And I think that front end from the Grand Prix really gives it a distinctive look that, well, I tend to like a little bit better even than the U.S., let's say, full-size Pontiacs, the front end that they wore for 1967. Now, another cool thing about that particular element of styling on the Grande Parisienne was that you could also get that Grand Prix front end on a Grande Parisienne Safari wagon. So take a look here. This is an actual production Canadian Grande Parisienne Safari. Boy, that's a mouthful. Wagon with the Grand Prix front end from the U.S. on it. Boy, does that look cool and sinister. Again, something that you just could not get in the U.S. You could get, obviously, a Safari wagon like the Bonneville Safari, but you could not get that front end on it. And of course, the model lineup wouldn't be complete if, to complement the four-door hardtop and the station wagon, you couldn't get a two-door hardtop, which you see here. This is a 1967 Grande Parisienne two-door hardtop. Now, this body is effectively the same or very similar as the 1967 Grand Prix from the U.S., with that somewhat more formal roofline. The Grande Parisienne and the Grand Prix had this particular roofline as opposed to the more fastback roofline that was used on the other full-size Pontiacs, which frankly I think the fastback roofline is the one that I prefer. But these Grande Parisiennes in coupe form, as I mentioned, the body is effectively very similar to a U.S. Grand Prix. And here for reference is the front end of the same car. So again, just a super attractive vehicle. I love that pointy snoot on these with really the arrowhead formation coming into play on the hood as well as the front header panel in addition to the bumper. Just a cool look. Now on the inside, Grande Parisienne interiors were quite tasteful, similar to the U.S. Pontiacs. You can see the dash is really the same with that horizontal speedometer. You have the glove box off to the right. It does say Grande Parisienne on the glove box as opposed to a U.S. Pontiac name. You did get that grab bar in front of the passenger, but there are some differences from the U.S. interior. Most notably, you can see here that the steering wheel is a three-spoke design that was not employed in the U.S. This was a design that was employed in Canada. And you can also see that if you take a look at the accelerator and the brake pedal, they do not look like the typical Pontiac accelerator and brake pedal of the era. And that's because they are borrowed from Chevrolet. So if you got a Grande Parisienne or a Canadian Pontiac, you did end up getting a different steering wheel, and you got the Chevrolet accelerator and brake pedal for '67, which, by the way, was something that you got on the Canadian Pontiacs for a number of years, including often the steering column or shift quadrant that had, well, let's talk about it now, an interesting transmission associated with it, as well as engine combinations that were not available in the U.S. Let's turn now to discussing those, because for those who are not familiar, this will be a bit of a surprise. But Canadian Pontiacs were not equipped with Pontiac V8s. In fact, they were equipped with Chevrolet V8s, and in some cases even 6 cylinders. Let's take a look at the powertrain list shown here on the last page of the Canadian Pontiac brochure. Notice the standard engine in all the vehicles aside from the Grande Parisienne is the 155 Astro 6 250 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder engine. Something that, well, that is not going to move a full-size Pontiac with much speed, but that was the standard engine unless you got the Grande Parisienne, in which case you got a 195 horsepower Strato Flash 283 cubic inch V8. And yes, that is the Chevrolet 283 that you see listed there. Now, if you wanted more power in your Canadian Pontiac, you had 3 optional engines. The first was a 275 horsepower Astro Flame 327 V8, again, the Chevrolet small block engine. One up from that was a 325 horsepower Astro Jet 396 cubic inch big block Chevrolet V8. And then the top dog engine was a 385 horsepower, love this name by the way, Jet Flame 427 V8 engine. Take a look and notice that the transmissions from an automatic transmission standpoint that were offered with these were often the Power Glide, and the Hydromatic was only available if you got the big block engines unless you had the 2+2 Parisien. Now, the other strange thing here is that the top engine in these Canadian Pontiacs, the 385 horsepower Jet Flame 427, actually offered more gross horsepower than the top engine that was available in U.S. full-size Pontiacs, which was a 376 horsepower, high-output 428 cubic inch V8. I would say that's obviously not much of a power difference, just 9 horsepower difference between those engines. And realistically, gross horsepower ratings were, let's just call them lax at best. So in truth, the power between those two engines is comparable. Maybe even the Pontiac, actually, having driven some of these, feels a bit zippier. But at least on paper, the Canadian Pontiac was the one that had the more powerful engine under hood. One other thing I love about the powertrains in these Canadian Pontiacs is take a look here at this 396 horsepower engine that is under hood in one of the 67 Grande Parisiens I was previously showing to you. You notice that obviously it's a Chevrolet big block. Anybody who's familiar with the shape of the Chevrolet big block knows those supersized valve covers and exhaust manifolds that you see there. But one of the things that you often got was a decal on the air cleaner that had the Pontiac logo or Pontiac name and then the Chevrolet engine size, which just looks weird. This is an aftermarket air cleaner here, but you notice the Pontiac logo and it says 396 underneath it. Just thought that was something that was, well, different. In any case, if you're looking for a super cool and rare Pontiac, these 67 Grande Parisiennes are some of the most beautiful vehicles. I'd love to have a Grande Parisienne Safari. That would be awesome. Or a Grande Parisienne with the 396 or 427 V8, just as a conversation piece, because again, just something you couldn't get in the United States. And there you have it for the Pontiac aficionados, a little bit of history on the 1967 Grande Parisienne. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and bottom right for some suggestions for you. Thanks again for watching.